For 6 weeks, nobody in Britain noticed that this man was dead. Not his bank, not his landlord. Not one person filed a missing report because his name was still being used every day by somebody else. He came up in a fishing net off the Devon coast, with nothing in his pockets, no wallet, no papers, nothing with a name on it. One object on his body gave him back his name and told the police the exact day he died. It was not a fingerprint. It was a repair slip. 6 miles off the coast of Devon, on a stretch of the English Channel that fishermen mostly leave alone, a trawler called the Malcarry hauled up its nets. There was a man in them. He had been in the water long enough that the crew knew, before they had him over the rail, that this was not a rescue. They radioed it in. The Coast Guard came out, and when the police finally laid him on a table and went through what he had on him, they found the thing that would make this case, for 6 weeks, impossible. Nothing. No wallet, no papers, no keys, no letters, no photographs, no rings. Not a receipt in a pocket, not a laundry mark in a collar. A man of about 50 pulled out of the sea in the summer of 1996, and not one object on his body that could tell anyone in Britain who he was, except one, still fastened to his right wrist, under the salt and the weed, was a wristwatch, an old one, the only thing he owned that anybody had bothered to leave him. That watch would give him back his name, and then it would do something no one expected. It would tell them the day he died. Start with the problem in front of the police, because it is stranger than it sounds. When a body comes out of the sea in England, the first thing detectives do is very simple. They go to the missing persons lists. Somebody, somewhere, has usually noticed. A wife, a landlord, an employer, a brother who expects a phone call on a Sunday. In a country of nearly 60 million people, a 50-year-old man does not simply stop existing without leaving a hole behind him. Detectives in Devon checked the lists. They checked them again. They widened the search to the whole of the United Kingdom, and they found the same answer every time. Nobody was looking for him. There was no report, no hole. Whoever this man was, he had been dead for weeks, and in all that time, not one person in Britain had walked into a police station to say that someone they knew had not come home. So they worked with what they had. A post-mortem put him in his late 40s or early 50s. He was fit, not wealthy, not neglected. There was an injury to the back of his head, the kind of thing that could be a fall against a boat rail or a blow, and at that stage nobody could say which. There was water in him. He had gone into the sea alive, or close to it, and there was the watch. The officers logged it the way you log everything. Description, condition, wrist. A steel wristwatch, old, still on his arm. In a file with no name on the front, it was one line among many. Here is what nobody in that room could have known yet. The reason there was no missing persons report was not that this man had no life. It was that his life was, at that moment, still being lived by somebody else. Somewhere in the north of England there was a bank account in his name, a driving license in his name, correspondence arriving in his name, and a man collecting all of it who had every reason to make sure that name was never reported missing. That is the shape of this case. Not a man who vanished, a man who had been replaced. And the strange, small mercy of it is this. The person who took his name had been careful with every document, every signature, every detail of a life he had stolen and worn for 4 years, and he had left, on the dead man's wrist, the one object he did not think to take. To understand why a man ended up in a fishing net off Devon, you have to go back 6 years and 4,000 miles west to a small town in Ontario, Canada. There, a financial advisor had built exactly the kind of practice people trust. He was not a stranger with a brochure. He was a man from the community, well-spoken, active in his church, the sort of advisor whose clients were also his neighbors. They gave him their retirement money. They gave him inheritances, house sales, the proceeds of a lifetime of work. And they gave it to him because handing money to someone you see on a Sunday does not feel like a risk. By 1986, his investment business was in trouble. A stock collapse tore a hole in the accounts, and the hole did not get smaller. What happened next is the oldest sequence in financial crime. Money from the newest clients was used to cover the oldest. Statements were produced that described returns nobody had actually earned, and every month the gap grew. By 1990, the figure was roughly 3.2 million Canadian dollars, taken from something like 70 people. Not institutions. People. It is worth slowing down on that number, because 70 is not an abstraction. 70 clients in a town that size means 70 households, and the money that goes to a small-town advisor is not speculative money. It is the sale of a farm. It is a widow's insurance payout. It is what a couple has instead of a pension, handed over in a front room to a man who will be at the same service on Sunday. Fraud of that kind does not merely take savings. It takes them from people who then have to keep living in the same streets as the person who took them, and who spend years being told, politely, that these things take time to resolve. None of those people got an explanation. What they got, one December, was an absence. In December 1990, he did not wait for the accounting to catch up with him. He left the country. He left behind a wife and children, and he took with him his 15-year-old daughter. 3 years later, Canada charged him, in his absence, with 18 counts of fraud, theft, and money laundering. By then, the charges were paperwork filed against a man who, as far as anybody could establish, no longer existed. He surfaced in England, in Harrogate, a prosperous spa town in North Yorkshire, the kind of place where a well-mannered man with money and no visible history attracts curiosity but not suspicion. He called himself David Davis. He set up in business. He rented property. He and his daughter lived as a couple, and the neighbors who noticed a young woman with an older man assumed the ordinary thing. But a false name is a thin thing. A name you invent has no history behind it. No birth certificate, no school record, no national insurance number, no bank that has known you for 20 years. Sooner or later, a life built on an invented name meets a form it cannot fill in. What he needed was not a false identity. It was a real one. And in about 1992, he met a man who had one going spare. Ronald Joseph Platt was in his 40s, a former soldier, a television repairman, a practical man who fixed things with his hands. He had no money, no property worth the word, and almost nobody close to him. He had, in the phrase one of the detectives on this case would use years later, very few possessions. And he was proud of the ones he had. What Ronald Platt did have was a dream, and he talked about it. Canada. Space, work, a fresh start. The kind of life that does not happen in a rented flat in the north of England. And this new friend of his, generous, encouraging, apparently delighted by the idea, helped him go. He helped him with the arrangements. He helped him with the money. And when Ronald Platt got on the plane in 1992, he left behind, with a man he trusted, the entire paper record of his existence. The birth certificate, the driving license, the documents that make a person legible to a state. From that moment, there were two Ronald Platts. One of them was in Canada, unemployed, running out of money, sinking quietly. The other was in Yorkshire, opening bank accounts, moving funds, signing forms in a dead straight hand, building a legitimate financial life on a legitimate name, a name with a real history, real credit, and no connection whatsoever to a fraud investigation in Ontario. It worked. For 4 years, it worked perfectly. And then, in 1995, the plane came back. Put yourself, for a second, on the wrong side of this. You have spent 4 years becoming a man, not pretending to be him, being him. Your bank knows you by that name. Your correspondence arrives in it. Every safe thing you own is held in it. And now the man himself is standing in England again, broke, with nowhere to go, expecting the friend who paid his way to Canada to help him land. Two men cannot hold one name, not in a country that runs on paperwork. What happens next reads, in the trial record, like generosity. He found Platt somewhere to live, not in Yorkshire, where the borrowed name was in daily use, but far away, in the southwest of England. He helped him with money. He kept in touch. He stayed, in every visible respect, the good friend who had once bought a man a ticket to a better life. He was also, throughout, the only person in England who knew both halves of the story. In the summer of 1996, there was a boat, a yacht, moored on the south coast, that he kept and sailed and knew well, a 16-foot world of his own where he was neither David Davis nor Ronald Platt, just a man on the water. Her name was the Lady Jane. On the 8th of July, 1996, someone walked into a chandlery and bought an anchor, a small one, 10 pounds in weight. Nothing remarkable. Half the boats on that coast carry one. The purchase was paid for in a name. R. Platt. 12 days later, on the 20th of July, Ronald Platt was invited out for a day's sailing. We know some of what happened after that from the physical evidence, and some of it from a jury's conclusion. And it is worth being precise about the difference. What the prosecution proved to that jury, 3 summers later, was this: that Ronald Platt went out on that boat, that he was struck on the back of the head, and that he went into the English Channel with an anchor pushed into his belt, in water deep enough and far enough out that the sea does not generally give things back. It should have ended there, genuinely. On the arithmetic of it, it should have ended there. Consider what the man on that boat had going for him. His victim was not reported missing, because the only person who would have noticed was the man who had killed him. The victim's identity was not merely stolen, but occupied. So any letter, any bill, any official query about Ronald Platt would arrive at the killer's own address and be answered, correctly, in a familiar hand. The body was in the channel, the pockets were empty, and the stretch of seabed he had chosen was, as the police would later put it, a place that almost nobody trawls. He had removed the wallet. He had removed the papers. He had thought about it. He left the watch on. And there was a reason to leave it. A reason that made sense right up until the moment it destroyed him. A body found stripped of everything, including a wristwatch, is a body somebody robbed. A body with a watch still on it is a man who fell in. The watch was the alibi. 8 days later, 6 miles off Teignmouth, the Mulcahy put its nets down in water it did not usually work. Here is the part of this case that nobody dramatizes, because it is filing. A body with no name generates a particular kind of police work. Dental records, if you have a jaw and a candidate to match it to. Fingerprints, if the person is on record. And Ronald Platt, a television repairman with no criminal history, was not. Clothing labels, retail chains, laundry marks, appeals in the local press, national missing persons databases, then international ones. Every one of those routes needs a candidate name to test against. And the Devon detectives did not have one. A recovery from the sea makes all of it harder. Seawater and time take the things investigators normally lean on. A face becomes unreliable for identification. Clothing loses its labels or is lost altogether. Paper in a pocket stops being paper. What is left is bone, dentition, and whatever was made of metal. They did the appeals. A man of about 50, recovered off the South Devon coast, described in the local press in the flat language forces use when they are hoping somebody's neighbor is reading. Nothing came back that fitted. They ran the description against forces further up the country, and nothing came back from there either. It could not have. The only address that man had in Britain was one he had been moved to by the person who killed him, and the only person likely to report him gone was that same person. 6 weeks passed. in an unidentified body case. 6 weeks is close to the point where a file changes character, where a person becomes a case number that stays open for years. Which brings us to the watch. It was a Rolex, an Oyster Perpetual Datejust, and by 1996 an old one, something like 25 years old, worn, salt-marked, and still on the wrist of a man whose name nobody knew. Now, a wristwatch is not, on the face of it, an identification. Millions of them exist. It carries no name, no address, no fingerprint of ownership. If you have ever wondered why the police did not simply look it up on day one, that is why. There is nothing on the outside of a watch that says who wore it. But there is something on the inside. Every Rolex carries a serial number, and the company that makes them keeps records, not just of what was sold, but of what came back. Every service, every repair, every time a movement is opened on a bench, is written down against that number, with the name of the person who brought it in and the shop that took it. The Devon officers sent the watch away.
Rolex kept records of every watch they had ever sold or repaired.
What came back, after weeks of paperwork moving between a police force in the southwest of England and a watch company's service archive, was 2 lines in a maintenance history. Twice in the 1980s, that specific watch, that serial number, no other, had been taken in for servicing at Fattorini Jewelers in Harrogate, North Yorkshire. And the customer name recorded against both visits was R.J. Platt.
That was directly how we identified him.
6 weeks of an unidentifiable man, resolved by a repair slip from a high street shop a decade before he died. Not forensics, bookkeeping. And then the same object did the second thing. The Datejust is a self-winding watch. It has no battery. It is powered by the motion of the arm that wears it, and it runs, once that motion stops, only as long as the energy already wound into it. A day, 2 days, not more. It is also waterproof, and it does not care that its owner has stopped moving. It kept running in the channel, on a dead man's wrist, until the reserve ran out. Then it stopped, and it held, in its little window, the last date it had reached. When investigators looked at the face of that watch, the hands read 11:35, and the date window read 22. Work backwards. The body came up in the last days of July. The watch had stopped days before that, still showing the 22nd, which meant this man had not gone into the water shortly before he was found. He had gone in around the 20th of July, run down, drifted, and been pulled up by a net a week later. A machine on his wrist had recorded the approximate day of his own death, and then held the number up for anyone who knew how to read it. Now the police had 2 things they had not had that morning: a name and a window in time. And with a name and a window, everything that had been invisible became searchable. Where he lived, who paid his rent, who had seen him last, and who, exactly, had been signing that name on documents in Yorkshire, while the man it belonged to was face down in the Channel. On the 20th of August, 1996, the trail from the watch brought detectives to the door of a man they knew as Mr. Davis. He was calm. By every account of that first contact, he was entirely calm. Asked when he had last seen Ronald Platt, he said June. Asked where Platt was now, he said France, gone abroad. That was the sort of thing he did. 2 days after the first knock, on the 22nd of August, that was still his answer. It was already the wrong one. He was speaking to officers who had a watch that said the 20th of July and who had spent 6 weeks learning to read a life backwards from a serial number. His name was Albert Johnson Walker, the financial advisor from Ontario. 70 clients, $3.2 million, 18 counts waiting for him in a country he had left 6 years earlier with his daughter and without his wife. And once the police had that, the rest of the file assembled itself with the awful tidiness of a man who had kept good records all his life. The Anchor, bought on the 8th of July, 12 days before the sailing trip, paid for in the name R. Platt, the name of the man it would be used to sink. The yacht's satellite navigation. A GPS unit does not have opinions, it stores positions. The Lady Jane's navigation data placed the boat, at the relevant time, in the stretch of water where a body would later come up in a trawler's net. A plastic bag on board, carrying Ronald Platt's fingerprint. And in the middle of it, at the arrest, a detail that no writer would dare invent. His daughter, now in her 20s, found pushing gold bars into a baby's changing bag. He had built a life that could survive an audit. What he had not planned for was a maintenance record. The trial ran for 11 days at Exeter Crown Court in June 1998. He did not deny the fraud. He had never really been able to. The Canadian charges were a matter of record, and by then, his own family was giving evidence. That part of the trial is the hardest to sit with. The daughter he had taken out of Canada at 15, who had spent 6 years living under a false name as his wife, gave evidence against her father. Her explanation for her own part in it was that he had hypnotized her. Whether a jury believed the mechanism or not is almost beside the point. What it describes is a person who had been inside another person's control for the whole of her adult life, trying to account for it in the only language she had. She was a child when it started. Nobody has ever suggested she chose any of it. What he denied, what he has denied ever since, was the killing. His account was that Ronald Platt had gone to France and that whatever happened to him afterwards had nothing to do with the man who had spent 4 years wearing his name. The jury was out for 2 hours.
Mr. Justice Butterfield, sentencing. A callous, premeditated killing.
Life imprisonment. In 2005, he was transferred to a Canadian prison. In 2007, a court in Kingston, Ontario, added 4 years for the fraud that had started all of it. In 2023, at 77, after 26 years inside, he was granted 60 days of temporary day parole. In February 2024, the board refused him, again unhappy, in part with the way he described what he had done. He has never admitted the murder. What stays with me about this case is not the fraud and not the boat. It is that a man was erased so thoroughly that a country of 60 million people did not register his absence. No one filed a report. His name went on being used, correctly, in banks and on forms by somebody else. For 6 weeks he was a body on a table with a case number instead of a name, the closest thing to a perfect erasure that a person can achieve. And what undid it was not brilliance, and not luck exactly. It was that somewhere in Yorkshire, in the 1980s, a man who did not have much walked into a jeweler's with the one good thing he owned and asked them to look after it. A clerk wrote his name in a book against a number. That book outlived him. He was proud of that watch. It was, by every account, his best possession, and he kept it running. In the end, it did 2 things for him that nobody else did. It said his name when he could not, and it counted out the last day of his life, accurately, on a wrist in the dark, and waited 8 days in the cold water for somebody to come and read it.